Hey Sam, how's it going?
Oh, it's okay.
Why is that?
Well, I can't find any housing in this town. It's kind of getting me down.
It's getting me down too.
I wish I could talk to someone about it.
Well, it's funny you say that. There's someone I know we could talk to about that.
Oh, really? Who?
Brit Fontenot. He's the director for Bozeman Economic Development.
Sweet. Let's go, Will.
So, Sam, Brit is Bozeman's Economic Development Director, and he focuses on building a strategic vision, building relationships and partnerships to allow for the successful implementation of economic development programs and services for the city of Bozeman. To summarize House Bill 259, which encompasses housing, it's an act that prohibits local governments from requiring housing fees from the local housing authority or the dedication of real property for future development for the purposes of providing housing for specified income levels and prohibiting certain zoning regulations.
With that being said, Britt, are you familiar with HB 259? And if so, what were the policy objectives and stakeholders involved in the passage of this bill?
Yes, I am familiar with 259. The city of Bozeman took a position against that bill when it was in during the session that you referred to, and the reason being is because we saw the ability to use inclusionary zoning as a tool to require affordable housing as a very useful tool. And in fact, we had through that use of that tool prior to its being stricken from the statutes, we're able to put about 17 homes on the ground here in Bozeman using those statutes.
In the bill, it also mentioned real property. Can you define what real property means?
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, real property is something that you have a title to or deed to.
So why were opponents of this bill, I'm not opponents, why were those in favor of this bill looking to remove inclusionary zoning?
Yeah, well, I think there's part of it is philosophical. I mean, there are some elements there are some questions about what is government's responsibility. And many minimalists of government would say, well, government's responsibility is public health, safety, and welfare, and not much more than that. And there are others who feel like other camps, other philosophies who see government having a role to play in a variety of areas, and including using regulations to incentivize or to require, I should say, certain types of housing. And so I think that's part of the divide that we saw, or the difference of opinion in terms of the bill's opponents versus the proponents. It's a philosophical difference on the role of government.
Okay. All right. I'm now going to hand it over to Will to ask question number 2.
I'm going to jump to our question about community housing and affordable housing. So can you, for House Bill 259, can you talk about and define the difference between community housing and affordable housing and what that means for Bozeman?
Sure, I'll try. I mean, that's an interesting question because I think a lot of people see those two, community housing and affordable housing, very differently, because affordability is a relative term. I mean, affordability to me may not be affordability to Elon Musk, for example, or some other high roller. My point simply being is that when you use the phrase or term affordable housing, it's not, it can mean different things to different people based on their own experiences. Community housing, on the other hand, I think is more representative of what Bozeman's strategy has been, which is trying to provide housing for a variety of people across the community, variety of economic strata across the community, from the lower end to the upper end, and that missing middle, that all important missing middle, which is the workforce of our community.
So proponents of House Bill 259 speak about ways of making housing more affordable, but they believe that inclusionary zoning, which this bill has effectively cut, puts too much of the financial burden on developers and home buyers. Speaking for Bozeman, would you agree with this statement? Why or why not?
Well, I mean, I think part of that is back to the original question on the philosophy of why you would support or oppose this particular bill. I think many of the proponents of 259 prefer a more of a market-based approach to this issue. Let the market drive the demand, let the market set the cost. When people aren't willing to buy it anymore, then you know it's too expensive. So that market-based approach, while practical in some cases, is really in a market that's completely red hot and out of control, like in Bozeman,
yeah,
doesn't really solve the problem.
The zoning regulations in this bill have to be made in accordance with the growth policy compatible with urban growth, which encourages the most appropriate use of land within the jurisdictional area, which is Bozeman. Can you talk about what Bozeman's urban growth policy looks like right now and what the future might hold?
Sure. So a growth policy is what we would call a guiding document. It doesn't set forth any sort of strict regulatory requirements, right? It's more of like, hey, this is how we see ourselves growing over the next 5 years. And every 5 years, a community is required to update their growth policy or their community plan. It's got a couple different names. And so generally speaking, it lays out this very broad sense of how the community will be growing based upon a multitude of factors: available land, transportation corridors, for example, and other infrastructure. And so the city's growth policy that was recently just updated includes a variety of zoning districts, a variety of which can then host a variety of housing types. But there has to be alignment between the zoning that you put in place and the goals of the community in terms of what kinds of housing that they want built. So, for example, briefly, R1 zoning is the least dense type of zoning designation that we have for residential in Bozeman. So you're going to get fewer units, right? Fewer dwelling units in an R1 zone. If you go to R4, now you can build taller, you can add density, and you use less land, which is one of the expensive variables in the building world, which is land costs, labor costs, and materials costs. And right now, all three of them are sky high here in this area.
So what is the R4 plan of Bozeman?
The community plan?
Yeah, just like within R4.
Within the R4 zone?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not looking at it right now.
Yeah.
But I would say that generally it allows R4 zoning. Zoning is the promise, right? It's just saying, hey, this is the kind of these are the types of building. This is what the built environment can look like, right? If you maxed it out with these criteria. So R4 zoning includes taller buildings, 5 or 6 stories tall, with more dense living arrangements. Mixed use is a very popular term and a very popular way of building the environment these days, because the concept is you want people, but you also want commercial services surrounding the people so that they don't have to drive everywhere, which is hopefully allows you to build smaller and fewer roads, which cuts down on the cost, which is directly applicable to the taxpayer in terms of how much property tax they might have to pay to the city anyway. And so all these issues are interconnected in very, very real ways that ultimately result in how much money the landowner, the property owner, is paying in their taxes. Because in Montana, property taxes are the way these infrastructure bits get funded.
Thank you.
That kind of jumps into the next point here, in that if there is an alternative to House Bill 259, what would that look like to you? How would you kind of draw that up? If you could just talk about kind of a best alternative to that, something that might be able to pass right now in Bozeman or, the general state of Montana, and what that would kind of look like.
Well, that's a big one. So, right now, the law of the land is there is no inclusionary zoning. And so we've had to adapt to that in Bozeman. We see that as just the removal of one of the tools of the few that we have to try and make the regulatory tool to make this happen. So, some people would characterize that as the stick. So now all we have is the carrot in Bozeman. But unfortunately, we had a mill levy on the ballot last year that failed. And so the carrot, or the incentive, is also not on the table at this point. And so we're forced to now, in this circumstance, to basically negotiate every development with each developer when they bring a project into the city, and really ask really nicely if they would consider putting some affordable housing units in their mix, and up to maybe 20%. Now that some developers think that is a great idea, and they were already thinking that through, and others, that's not in their pro forma, and that's just not part of what's going to work for them financially. And so with that, it means that we have to negotiate every deal every time. There's no consistency. There's no pathway. Each one's unique, so we don't have a template. And so it means that our efforts at getting these types of units now take more time, and they cost, from a staff perspective, they cost more resources because we spend so much more staff time doing these one-offs, every single time. Now, we do have an affordable housing ordinance that we're working through, updating and revising, that are making some code-based changes that we hope also incentivize these types of projects. But that's still in the works, and we're making sure that it checks all the legal boxes. And the last piece I'll mention is leveraging urban renewal districts. So that's been a tool that has been successful for us in the past, because we have money that's been set aside through the tax increment financing and urban renewal programs that are still allowed by state law, where we can invest public dollars in public infrastructure. And that ability to incentivize projects in some sense, sometimes millions of dollars worth of public infrastructure, we have been able to close the gap for the developer, and they were then willing to bring in some affordable units on that spectrum that we talked about earlier.
To reiterate a few of the alternative policy solutions that Brit just brought up, would be an affordable housing ordinance that would market lower priced homes at 70% of area median income for the number of bedrooms in a home. Say 2 for a 4-person household divided by 12 to determine monthly income would be multiplied by 33% to determine affordable monthly housing payments for Bozemanites. A second alternative would be urban renewal programs that would take public funds and reinvest them into local infrastructure projects. And finally, a local sales tax to alleviate property owners in Bozeman from bearing the full burden and cost of the housing market.
Hey Sam, do you feel better about the housing policies in Bozeman now?
Well, after the conversation we just had with Brit, I sure do. The policies may not be where they need to be yet, but with the help of the local community and students like you, we can make it happen.